I had just buried my wife when her phone buzzed with an unbelievable message, the red recipe book, Unit 22. Don't let him see. I stood frozen beside her grave. When I got home, I immediately checked the kitchen. I found a hidden key taped inside that old recipe book. So I drove there alone, believing I was just following her final wish. But when the door opened, everything I once knew shattered. The life I believed in turned out to be a lie, and nothing would ever be the same again. Hello, everyone, and thank you sincerely for being here. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you watching from today? Your presence means more than you might think. Share your location in the comments so we can see how far this story travels. Also, please note some details are fictionalized for storytelling and learning purposes. Any resemblance to real people or places is purely coincidental, though the message behind it still matters. The Boston wind didn't just howl. It bit, tearing through my wool coat and chilling the very marrow of my 71-year-old bones as I watched the dark wood of Eleanor's casket disappear under a dusting of January white. Thane Garrison, a 71-year-old retired ethics teacher whose sharp eyes and silver hair still carry the authority of 4 decades in the classroom, stood shivering by my wife's open grave. The smell of damp earth and pine needles rose to meet the freezing air, a heavy scent that marked the end of 48 years of shared breakfasts and quiet evenings. Beside me stood my son, Sterling Garrison, 41, in a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than my first car, his eyes tracking the mourners with the professional detachment of a high-stakes lawyer. He was weeping, the tears tracing perfect lines down his face, but I noticed his left hand twitching toward his cuff. He was checking his luxury watch again. It was a performance, a timed display of grief, calibrated for the benefit of the partners from his firm who stood a respectful distance away. Next to him, my granddaughter, Ilara Garrison, 9, clutched a small, stuffed rabbit to her chest, her wide eyes reflecting a world that had suddenly become incomprehensible following her grandmother's death. "Is Grandma sleeping in the dirt?" Ilara asked, her voice small and trembling against the whistling wind that rattled the bare oak branches above us. "It's time to say goodbye." Dad Sterling whispered, his hand firm on my shoulder, his touch feeling more like an executive decision than a gesture of comfort. How many times had I stood in this very spot for others, a dozen, 2 dozen, but the ground never feels the same when it is your own heart being lowered into it. The salt sting of frozen tears burned my cheeks as the minister began the final benediction. Just as the prayer reached its amen, I felt a sharp, rhythmic vibration in my right pocket. It was jarring, a mechanical intrusion into the sanctity of the burial. I reached in, expecting my own phone, but my fingers closed around something smaller. I pulled out Eleanor's old, small smartphone, a device I had personally switched off and tucked into her bedside drawer 3 nights ago. The screen flickered to life, its blue glare blindingly white against the fresh snow on the dark casket wood. The metal was cold, too cold, like holding a piece of the winter itself. A single notification lit up the glass, an alert from a number that wasn't saved in her contacts. The message was brief, demanding, and utterly impossible. "Not here. Walk to the parking lot." Read alone. My breath hitched, a plume of white vapor dissipating in the gale as I realized the sender. The text was coming from Eleanor's own number, a scheduled message set to trigger only after her heartbeat had stopped. It was a dead man's switch, a secret she had carried through her final days, while I was busy holding her hand and whispering lies about the spring. She had planned this moment down to the very second, knowing exactly when the dirt would hit the wood. I felt a surge of adrenaline-fueled shock that made my pulse roar in my ears. I ignored Sterling's outstretched hand and his scripted look of concern. I turned my back on the grave and the mourners heading toward my old Toyota Camry in the parking lot, my thumb hovering over the screen that shouldn't have been glowing at all. I slammed the heavy door of my Toyota, the thud muffled by the snow, and suddenly the absolute silence of the cabin felt more suffocating than the graveyard air. I sat there for a long moment, my chest heaving the familiar sense of old peppermint and dust, acting as a thin veil against the harsh reality outside. The 1998 Camry was my sanctuary, a relic of a simpler time. Yet today it felt like an interrogation room. I pulled Eleanor's phone from my pocket. My fingers were numb, fumbling with the slick glass, as the blue light illuminated my trembling hands. I expected a passcode prompt, some barrier between me and her secrets, but the screen slid open with a simple swipe. She had left the door wide open for me. I began scrolling, my breath fogging the windshield, until the world outside became a gray smear. That is when I saw it. The phone was a hollow shell. There was no outgoing call history, no saved drafts, and not a single text message sent in the last 3 years. Eleanor had scrubbed it clean, systematically, erasing every digital footprint she had made while the cancer ate away at her body. She had left only this trail of breadcrumbs for me to find a ghost leading me by the hand. "Talk to me, Eleanor," I whispered, watching my breath vanish against the glass. The silence of the car was heavy, a physical weight pressing against my shoulders. Just as the chill began to seep through my coat, the phone vibrated in my palm. It was another message timed with a precision that made my skin crawl. "Safeguard Storage, Industrial Parkway, Unit 22. My heart gave a painful thud against my ribs. You have to understand, Eleanor didn't even like Industrial Parkway. She called it the concrete scar of Boston, a place of transit and anonymity that represented everything she disliked about modern life. Why would she keep a piece of herself there? The text wasn't finished. Below the address, a new line appeared. The red recipe book, second shelf from the bottom. "Don't let him see." I knew that book. It sat in our kitchen, its spine cracked from decades of Sunday dinners and holiday feasts. It was the heart of our home, yet she had turned it into a hiding place for a brass key I never knew existed. The instructions were a ghost's hand on my steering wheel, turning me away from my grief and toward a cliff I hadn't seen coming. This wasn't just a final wish. It was a warning, a directive born of a fear she had never shared with me in 40 years of marriage. I reached for the ignition, my hand shaking as I turned the key. The engine turned over with a reluctant metallic groan, protesting the cold, just as much as I protested the path I was now forced to walk. I glanced at the rearview mirror to check for an opening in the cemetery traffic, but my eyes locked onto a figure near the gates. Sterling was standing there, his hands buried deep in his black wool coat. He wasn't looking at the flowers or the retreating mourners. He was staring directly at my car. His eyes narrowed with a look of cold, calculating intensity that I didn't recognize. I threw the car into reverse, my heart hammering against my ribs, because for the first time in 40 years, I was terrified of my own son. The house smelled like the lilies from the wake and the ghost of the Earl Grey tea Eleanor used to drink, a combination that made my stomach turn as I stepped across the threshold of a life that no longer existed. I moved through the foyer with a heaviness in my limbs, the silence of the hallways mocking the frantic rhythm of my heart. Every creak of the floorboards felt like a betrayal of the sanctuary we had built here. I headed straight for the kitchen, my focus narrowing on the small bookshelf tucked into the corner. It was Eleanor's domain, filled with the weathered spines of her culinary collection. I reached for the joy of cooking, but as I pulled the heavy volume toward me, I realized this wasn't just a hiding spot. The margins were crowded with her neat, slanted script, but they weren't notes on temperature or seasoning. They were logs, coded entries detailing Sterling's visits, the exact times of his late-night phone calls, and cryptic references to papers he had been looking for while she was too weak to leave her bed. My breath hitched. "Where is it, Eleanor? Where did you hide it?" I whispered into the empty room. My fingers fumbled with the back cover peeling at the linen lining. Taped to the inside leaf was a heavy brass key, its weight surprising against my palm. The yellowed adhesive curled away like dead skin, revealing a small handwritten note on the page itself. It wasn't a recipe. It was a date from 3 months ago and a single chilling sentence. "Forgive me, Thane, but the foundation is rotting." I felt like a thief in a temple desecrating the memory of our Sunday dinners to find a weapon I wasn't even sure I knew how to use. The kitchen clock ticked with a rhythmic mechanical aggression, sounding less like a timepiece and more like a countdown. I stared at the key, the brass glinting under the fluorescent light, realizing that my wife had spent her final months not just fighting for life, but preparing for a war against our own flesh and blood. How could a man teach ethics for 40 years and fail to notice his own blood was hemorrhaging integrity? I had spent my career discussing the abstract nature of virtue while a predator was being raised at my own table. The realization was a physical blow, leaving me breathless in the center of the room where we used to dance while the pasta boiled. I gripped the key tightly, the sharp metallic bite of the brass digging into my clenched fist, as if to anchor me to reality. The weight of the secret settled into my marrow, turning my grief into something sharper and more dangerous. I needed to move to hide the evidence of my discovery, but my body felt locked in place by the enormity of her warning. Suddenly, the stillness was shattered by the heavy, rhythmic thud of a car door slamming in the driveway. My blood went cold. I looked at the clock. It was far too early for the others to be back. I peered through the slats of the kitchen blinds and saw the black sedan. Sterling. He had followed me home, moving with a purposeful stride that told me he wasn't here to offer comfort. The front door lock clicked, and I shoved the red book back onto the shelf, the brass key digging into the palm of my hand like a hot coal as my son's footsteps echoed in the hallway. The safeguard storage gate didn't just slide open. It groaned like a rusted secret being dragged into the gray light of a Boston dawn. I had spent the night in a state of brittle wakefulness, listening to the house breathe and waiting for the sun to offer me a chance to escape. I had managed to slip away at 6, leaving Sterling and his wife Romilly asleep in the guest wing. Romilly Garrison, a 38-year-old corporate consultant who navigated social circles with the same icy precision Sterling used in business, would likely be the first to notice my absence. But for now I was alone. I drove with my eyes glued to the rearview mirror, searching for the aggressive silhouette of Sterling's luxury SUV, my knuckles white against the steering wheel of the Camry. "Just a little further, Eleanor," I muttered. The biting cold of the morning air nipped at the back of my neck as I parked. When I approached the front desk, the sleepy attendant checked the records and frowned. I noticed then that the unit wasn't in the Garrison name at all. Eleanor had rented it under Sarah Miller. Her maiden name, a detail I hadn't seen her use in 40 years. It was a calculated move to ensure that no one, especially not her own son, with his penchant for digital surveillance and paper trails, could ever track it through family records. My wife had been a ghost in her own life, long before she actually passed. I followed the yellow lines on the floor toward the back of the facility. The corridor smelled of damp concrete and stagnant air, a heavy metallic scent that seemed to cling to my lungs. Stop. I held my breath, listening. Was that a footstep behind me? Or just the building settling into its own misery? I waited, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. But the only sound was the low hum of a distant heater and the rhythmic flickering of a single overhead fluorescent bulb. I reached Unit 22. The smooth brass key felt warm against my calloused thumb, a stark contrast to the freezing padlock it was meant for. I slid the key home and turned. The lock yielded with a snap that echoed through the empty hallway. I gripped the handle of the rolling door and heaved upward. The metallic screech was deafening, a thunderous clatter that felt like a gunshot in the quiet facility. As the door settled into the rafters, it revealed a small, clean space The unit was a tomb, not for a body, but for the version of my son I had spent 41 years believing in. In the center of the concrete floor sat a simple folding chair holding a tablet, and 4 banker's boxes stacked neatly beside it. I stepped inside the shadows, stretching long and thin behind me. Resting on top of the box labeled "The Truth About Sterling" was a small, fresh sprig of rosemary. It was Eleanor's favorite symbol for remembrance, and it hadn't completely withered yet. The edges were still supple, suggesting she had visited this very unit only days before the cancer finally pinned her to her bed. My vision blurred as I realized the strength it must have taken for her to hide this from me. I reached for the lid of the first box, my name written in Eleanor's elegant, steady hand. But my fingers froze as a low electronic beep emitted from the old tablet beside it. The blue light of the tablet sliced through the shadows of Unit 22, casting my own shaking reflection against the cold steel walls, a ghost looking at a ghost. I reached out and tapped the center of the screen, my heart hammering a rhythm of pure dread. The static hiss of the tablet audio preceded an image that almost broke me. It was Eleanor sitting in her sun-drenched study just months ago. She looked pale but resolute, her eyes carrying a clarity that I had mistaken for peaceful acceptance. "Thane, I'm so sorry I had to leave you with this," she said, her voice a phantom warmth against the freezing unit air. I hid it because I wanted our last months to be about us, not about the monster our son has become. Suddenly, the video flickered. In the background, the door to the study opened. I watched paralyzed as Sterling stepped into the frame. Eleanor's face didn't crumble. She merely adjusted her posture, offering him a serene, practiced smile as she tilted the screen away. It was a terrifying dance of cat and mouse played out in our own home, proving she had been living in a state of high-stakes theater while I slept soundly in the next room. Once the door closed again on the recording, her expression fell into one of agonizing urgency. "Finish what I couldn't, my love. For the people he broke." I sat back on the cold floor, the tablet resting on my knees, as the video looped into silence. I reached into the first banker's box, the smell of old paper and dust rising to meet me. Inside was a thick stack of heavy stationery, covered in Eleanor's steady, familiar handwriting. I began to read, and the world I thought I knew dissolved with every sentence. She had spent 3 years conducting a systematic investigation into Sterling's legal practice. Her voice was a silk thread, pulling me through a labyrinth of broken promises and bank statements. She detailed the moment in 2020 when she first noticed the discrepancies in the accounts of her friends. "I watched you grade those ethics papers and wept," she wrote, "knowing Sterling was using your name to pave over his crimes." She had documented everything, while I thought she was merely rereading her favorite novels. How does a mother look at the child she birthed and see a predator? I suppose she doesn't. She just sees the truth. She's forced to document a record of the rot that has replaced the innocence she once cherished. I felt a surge of fury that threatened to drown the grief. She had carried this burden alone, protecting my heart, even as the cancer began to consume her own. The letter provided a roadmap, a guide to the red folders stacked beneath the papers. "The evidence is in the red folders." The ink seemed to shimmer under the flickering fluorescent light. "Start with Helen." My hands trembled as I realized the depth of the betrayal Eleanor had uncovered. Sterling hadn't just stumbled into financial misconduct. He had been predatory from the start. He explicitly targeted Eleanor's own social circle, using her personal phone book to find his first victims. He had traded on our reputation to ruin those who trusted us most. I dropped the letter as my eyes fell on the first red folder, where a photograph of our best friend Helen Parker was clipped to a document labeled Case 1 Total Asset Liquidation. My hands moved to the red folder, not as a husband anymore, but as a witness to a crime that had begun at my own dinner table. I pulled the red folder toward me, the cardboard scraping against the folding chair like a blade on bone, and stared at Helen Parker's smiling face in a photo taken at our last New Year's Eve party. She looked so safe, then surrounded by people she considered family. I opened the file, the paper snapping under my touch, with an aggressive sharpness in the ink-scented cold of the storage unit. The top document was a contract for the Sunrise Senior Living Community Project in New Hampshire. It was a masterpiece of legal deception, promising a secure investment for Helen's $280,000 retirement fund. As I flipped through the pages, a slip of paper fell out, a carbon copy of a check. I felt the metallic taste of bile in my throat as I realized the date coincided with a luxury watch purchase. Sterling had used $15,000 of Helen's stolen life savings to buy the very Patek Philippe I had admired on his wrist at the funeral yesterday. The betrayal was layered, a grotesque cake of greed. I found the eviction notice Helen had been served from her previous home, dated the 14th of October. That was a Tuesday. Sterling had been dining at our house that very night, sipping my 20-year-old scotch and leaning back in his chair with a satisfied sigh. A great success for my client, he had told me then, while Helen was losing the roof over her head. Do you know what $280,000 looks like when it is just ink on a page? It looks like nothing. But when it is a widow's future, it looks like a death sentence. It is the difference between a warm bed and a cold sidewalk, between dignity and despair. I watched the rhythmic thumping of my own pulse in the veins of my hand, wondering how I could have been so blind to the shark circling our own pool. I dug deeper, finding internal memos from Sterling and associates. They were never meant to be seen by outside eyes. The language was clinical, devoid of any human empathy. Sterling had written a note to a developer named Gregory Walsh, a man whose reputation in the Boston real estate market was as polished as it was predatory. Walsh, the Parker assets are clear. Move to the next target. The efficiency of the instruction was chilling. My son had not just made a mistake. He had hunted a family friend with the cold precision of a ledger keeper. My name. He used my name to open the door, and then he stripped the house bare. It was the ultimate exploitation of trust. I turned the final page and found a small yellow sticky note in Eleanor's unmistakable handwriting. It was the final blow to my spirit. It revealed that Helen Parker had only reached out to Sterling for financial help because I had recommended him to her as the most honest man in Boston. I had been the bridge he used to cross over and burn her life to the ground. I closed the folder, my vision blurring with a heat that was not from the unit's lack of insulation, and realized that Helen was just the beginning. There were 19 more folders waiting in the dark. I didn't reach for the second box immediately. I had to lean against the corrugated metal wall of Unit 22 until the world stopped spinning and the bile in my throat retreated. The smell of cold, damp paper clung to the stagnant air, filling my lungs with the scent of long-buried deceits. When I finally found the strength to pull the second banker's box toward the center of the unit, the weight of it felt monumental. Inside, I found a meticulously organized ledger Eleanor had created during her final years. It was a harvest of misery, a list of names and lives reduced to ink on a page. I recognized them all. Thomas Warren, $220,000. I whispered, my voice cracking in the hollow space. He was a retired history teacher who had attended our 4th of July barbecues for a decade. Patricia Donnelly, $190,000. God help us. She was a widow from our church, a woman who had once brought Eleanor soup every day for a month when she first fell ill. Sterling hadn't just sought out wealth. He had targeted the vulnerable people who looked at my family and saw safety. Tucked between the pages of the ledger, I found a bank statement that made the dry copper taste of fear flood my mouth. It was an account opening in the Cayman Islands, dated the very same month I had been hospitalized for my heart scare 2 years ago. While I was lying in a hospital bed, wondering if I would see another Christmas, my son was building a vault for his stolen treasure. I sat on the small folding chair, the blinding white of the tablet screen, providing a harsh clinical glow in the dark unit. I pulled out a small notepad and began the rhythmic clicking of the calculator buttons, my fingers moving with a numb, mechanical precision. Eleanor had highlighted the consultation services Sterling charged for his legal guidance, a commission that totaled over $420,000. Do you know how long it takes an honest man to save $200,000, a lifetime of grading papers and skipping vacations? My son stole it in a single afternoon lunch, all while smiling across the table at people who called him by his first name. As I added the final figures, the sound of blood rushing in my ears became a dull roar. The grand total was staggering. $3,700,000. A number that large should have its own gravity. It should collapse the floor beneath me and drag me down into the earth. It was a sum of money that represented dozens of stolen retirements, houses lost, and legacies erased. I stared at the final tally, my vision blurring. This wasn't a series of mistakes or a business deal gone south. It was a machine. Sterling had built a machine that turned the trust of our friends into his personal luxury. But as I reached the very bottom of the ledger, the final note in Eleanor's steady hand froze the air in my lungs. There was a pending transaction dated for the end of this month. It was for my own pension fund, the sum of my 40 years at the university. I realized then that my son wasn't just a thief who had betrayed our friends. He was a scavenger waiting for me to die. He was weeks away from siphoning my own life savings into the dark. I stared at the pending transfer from my own account, the ink still fresh in Eleanor's notes, and realized my son wasn't just a thief. He was a scavenger waiting for me to die. The tablet sat on the folding chair like a ticking bomb, and I knew the next file would be the one that finally broke me. The tablet screen flickered to life, its blue glare reflecting off my glasses like a digital interrogation, illuminating a file labeled Client Seminar. October 2021. I hesitated, the stale smell of the storage facility mixing with the ozone of the screen before tapping the play button. The video was grainy, and the camera work was shaky, clearly the effort of an amateur. As the frame stabilized, I realized the perspective was from the back of a crowded room. A woman's hand briefly adjusted the lens, and I saw the edge of a cheap synthetic wig. My heart stopped. Eleanor had been there disguised in a wig and sunglasses, documenting her own son's lies, while I thought she was home resting. On the screen, Sterling stood at a podium in a brightly lit hotel ballroom, radiating a warmth that felt like a physical heat, even through the low-quality recording. My father, Thane Garrison, spent 40 years teaching the youth of Boston that honor is the only currency that doesn't depreciate. Sterling said, his voice smooth and paternal. He clicked a remote, and a projected slide appeared behind him. It was a photo of Eleanor and me at our 40th anniversary, laughing and holding glasses of champagne. I carry that same honor into every real estate investment I vet for you. He didn't just steal their money. He stole my name. He stripped the skin off my career and wore it like a costume to lure the innocent toward the blade. I watched him pace the stage with a polished, insincere smile, using our love as a marketing tool for a scam that would leave our oldest friends in ruin. The camera panned slowly across the audience. I saw them all. Helen Parker was in the front row, looking at Sterling with a grandmotherly pride that made me feel physically ill. Beside her sat Thomas Warren, nodding along as Sterling spoke about legacy and security. We're doing this for our grandkids. Sterling Helen's voice drifted toward the microphone during a question period. We know we can trust a Garrison. The sound of polite, rhythmic applause echoed in the small unit, a hollow, mocking sound that felt like it was drumming against my skull. The hotel ballroom was a slaughterhouse, and Sterling was the butcher using my ethics textbook to sharpen his knives. I watched the exact moment these people began signing the documents on their tables, their pens moving with a trust I had spent decades cultivating. They weren't just sold an investment. They were sold me. As the video continued, the camera panned toward the wings of the stage. Standing there was a man I hadn't seen in years. Corbin Mercer, a 45-year-old former private investigator, turned corporate fixer known for his predatory efficiency and a relationship with the law that was purely transactional. He stood in the shadows as Sterling's security, his eyes vetting the crowd for potential dissenters with a predatory stillness. The magnitude of the violation was a deep moral injury, a weight that threatened to crush the very foundation of who I was. The video cut to black, and in the reflection of the screen, I saw the ghost of the man I thought I was shattered into 20 folders of ruin. I shoved the tablet aside, the plastic clattering against the concrete, and reached for the final stack of papers with hands that felt like they belonged to a dead man. The air in Unit 22 was thin and frigid, tasting of ash and the stale scent of industrial dust. I dug into the final box, finding a thick sheaf of printed emails that detailed the blueprints of my son's soul. The sharp, acidic smell of toner rose from the pages as I began to read. There in black and white was an exchange between Sterling and Gregory Walsh from early 2020. They weren't just discussing real estate. They were discussing me. Greg, my father, taught ethics for 40 years, Sterling had written with a clinical coldness that made my skin crawl. These people trust me because they trust him. That's our edge. Use it. The Garrison name is better than a bank guarantee. I felt a nauseating wave of horror. My career, my reputation, the very essence of the life I had built on a foundation of integrity had been weaponized against the people I cared for most. As I flipped the pages, the paper cut into my cold thumb, a small red bead of blood blooming on a line where Sterling had forged my signature. He had created a series of recommendation letters, making it appear as though I was a silent partner in the New Hampshire project. He hadn't just used my shadow. He had stolen my hand. How do you mourn someone who is still walking around in a tailored suit? How do you bury a ghost that still has your last name? I realized then that I wasn't reading the words of a man who had made a mistake. I was reading the inventory of a predator. Sterling's tone in later emails turned from predatory to mocking, calling the victims walking relics and easy marks, who were too focused on their grandchildren to notice their bank accounts bleeding dry. The boy I had raised with stories of honor and duty, the child I had coached and comforted, was nowhere in these pages. I didn't lose a son today. I whispered into the freezing air, my breath a fleeting ghost. I found out I never had one. I stood up, and my knees popped in the silence of the unit. The sound was like a gavel striking a bench, a final judgment on the man my son had become. I read the very last page, and the finality of it nearly brought me to my knees. Sterling had already drafted a contingency plan in case an investigation ever gained traction. He planned to blame the clerical errors on Eleanor, citing her cognitive decline and the stress of her cancer as the reason for the missing funds. He was going to use his dying mother as a tragic scapegoat to cover his own tracks. I gathered the folders, stacking them with a grim, mechanical precision. I stepped out of the unit into the blinding, flat Boston winter light. My eyes ached, but my mind was clearer than it had been in years. I began loading the boxes into the Camry, the weight of the paper, forcing the suspension to groan under the burden of the truth. I slammed the trunk with a sound of finality that echoed across the empty parking lot. I realized that to save Eleanor's soul and restore the lives of the people we loved, I was going to have to destroy our son. The house felt different. When I walked through the door, less like a home and more like a crime scene, waiting for the yellow tape to be stretched across the memories of our Sunday dinners. The drive home had been silent, the heater blowing hot, dry air that couldn't touch the frost in my chest. I carried the heavy banker's boxes into my study, the wood-paneled room where I had spent 40 years grading ethics papers and debating the nuances of moral philosophy. Now the stacks of paper felt like indictment. I cleared my desk of the funeral sympathy cards, thick, expensive, and utterly useless pieces of cardstock that smelled faintly of the perfume of neighbors I barely knew. In their place, I began to arrange Eleanor's red and blue folders. I found a digital recorder tucked into a hidden flap of the first box. When I pressed play, a voice I loved whispered through the room, followed by the oily, persuasive tones of my son. He was trying to convince Eleanor to sign over my power of attorney while I was still sedated in the hospital after my heart scare. First the red files, then the blue. I whispered, reciting Eleanor's instructions like a prayer. My hands were steady, but my mind was a storm. You didn't leave me a burden, Elle. You left me a map. I gripped a fresh notebook and a red pen, its nib scratching aggressively against the paper, as I began the meticulous process of cross-referencing. The smell of old paper and bitter cold coffee filled the room as the moon rose outside the window, casting long, skeletal shadows across the floor. How many times had I told my students that the truth is a solid foundation? I was wrong. The truth is a flood, and right now I was just trying to keep my head above the water. I looked at the red folders again. They were the victims. The blue folders were the mechanisms of the theft. As I dug deeper, moments from the last 2 years began to take on a sinister, retroactive clarity. I remembered Sterling's sudden generosity, the expensive watch he'd given me, the offer to pay for Eleanor's experimental treatments in Switzerland. It was all blood money, stolen from the very people who trusted our name. I sat in the heavy silence of the house, the metallic taste of old grief rising in my throat. I was 10 feet away. I was right downstairs watching the evening news while she was drowning in this, fighting a war in the room above my head. Tick, tick, tick. The grandfather clock in the hall sounded like a metronome for a funeral march. I realized then that my silent days ahead were not just for reading. They were for a psychological preparation to face a son who had become a total stranger. I was preparing to fight a man who wore my son's face but shared none of his soul. Then I found a printout near the bottom of the second box. It was a statement for my granddaughter Ilara's college fund. I had started that account the day she was born, and Eleanor had nurtured it like a garden. The balance at the bottom was a haunting, hollow zero. The funds had been redirected into a secret offshore account in the Cayman Islands. I stared at the zero balance in Ilara's college fund and felt a coldness settle in my gut that no heater could ever touch. He wasn't just a thief, he was a cannibal. My hands were shaking as I reached for the very bottom of the fourth box, searching for the one thing Eleanor said would save us. I shoveled aside a stack of fraudulent property deeds, my fingernails catching on the rough cardboard bottom of the box until I felt the sharp, stiff corner of a card that didn't belong in a pile of crimes. I pulled it free, holding a crisp, cream-colored business card that felt clinical and heavy in my hand. It was for the Elder Justice Legal Center, and the name printed on it was Sarah Williams. Sarah Williams, 34, was once Sarah Miller, the brightest, fiercest student in my 2007 ethics class, now a formidable attorney specialized in elder justice. I turned the card over to find Eleanor's elegant, steady handwriting. Class of 2007, she had written. She remembers your lecture on the social contract. Attached to the card, by a rusted paperclip, was a neon yellow post-it note. My eyes narrowed as I read Eleanor's observation. Sterling tried to hire her firm as a consultant last year. He wanted to buy her silence by creating a conflict of interest. She refused him. I felt a surge of adrenaline. Sterling was a master of the preemptive strike, but Sarah Miller had apparently developed a shield he couldn't penetrate. Sarah Miller, I whispered, the dusty, unventilated study air tickling my throat as the memory clicked. You were the one who wouldn't let the Thoreau debate end. I closed my eyes, seeing her in the front row of the lecture hall, her jaw set with that iron-willed determination as she challenged me on the boundaries of systemic duty. Eleanor hadn't just found a lawyer. She had picked a weapon I had personally helped to mold. I moved to my laptop, the blue artificial light of the screen reflecting in my eyes as I searched for her name. My hands had finally stopped shaking, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. I found her recent cases, high-profile wins against predatory lenders and nursing home conglomerates that had made headlines in the Boston Globe. I clicked on a news clip, and there she was, standing on the courthouse steps. She had the same sharp, observant eyes I remembered, though they were now tempered by years of seeing the worst of human greed. Does a teacher ever truly stop being responsible for their students? Or is this the final exam I never realized I was preparing her for? I realized then that I was looking at the person Eleanor had chosen to finish this fight. In another article, I read that Sarah had been publicly critical of firms like Sterling and Associates for months, citing them as examples of the gray market vultures picking at the bones of the elderly. She's already hunting him, I realized, a dark sort of pride blooming in my chest. She just needs the teeth. The business card felt like a polished stone in my hand, the kind you use to bring down a giant who thinks his armor is impenetrable. Digging further into a small envelope taped to the card, I found a series of receipts. Eleanor had been making small, anonymous monthly donations to Sarah's nonprofit for nearly 2 years. She hadn't just found the prosecutor. She had been quietly funding the very office that would eventually bring her son to justice. I reached for the house phone, my thumb hovering over the dial, prepared to finally make the connection. But I stopped when I noticed the rhythmic, persistent blinking of the red answering machine light. I had been so buried in the boxes that I hadn't heard it. It was a message from David Morrison that had been sitting there ignored for 3 hours. The doorbell didn't just ring. It pierced the silence of my study like an alarm forcing me to shove Sarah Williams's card into my pocket, as if it were a piece of contraband. I hurried to the kitchen, passing the answering machine where a sharp, rhythmic chirp announced the missed call. I didn't stop to play it. Instead, I opened the front door to find David Morrison, 70, my best friend, and a fellow retired teacher from Boston Lincoln High, who walked in with the heavy gait of a man who had shared every one of my burdens for half a century. The smell of winter dampness and wood smoke clung to his wool coat as he stepped into the foyer. I was so exhausted, so frayed by 3 days of staring into the abyss of Sterling's greed that I didn't question why he had arrived unannounced. I found out later that Sterling had called him earlier, playing the part of the devoted, concerned son. He had used David as a scout, a friendly face to peer through my windows and report back on my isolation. We sat in the kitchen, the air thick with the smell of burnt coffee I had forgotten on the burner. David looked at me with those weary, honest eyes, and my resolve simply buckled. I needed to tell someone. Eleanor didn't just leave a will, David, I said, my voice barely a rasp. She left a dossier. Sterling, he's in deep. I mentioned the red folders, the offshore accounts, the systematic harvest of our own friends' lives. I thought I was talking to a brother in arms. David squeezed my shoulder, his face pale. Robert, you look like a man who hasn't slept since the burial. Be careful what you dig up. Some things are better left in the ground. How many times had I taught my students that a secret is only a secret if you're the only one who knows it? My own exhaustion had made me the very hypocrite I spent 40 years warning against. When David left, he was visibly shaken, a vessel overflowing with a truth he wasn't built to carry. He went home to Margaret Morrison, his well-meaning but talkative wife, the kind of woman whose heart was as big as her social network, which made her the most dangerous person in Boston to tell a secret. He was talking about red folders, Margaret, David told her, out of genuine fear for my sanity. By the next morning, at a parent-teacher association meeting, Margaret was leaning in toward a friend, whispering about the legal documents I had found. The leak was slow-motion horror, a ripple in a pond that quickly became a tidal wave. The coffee was bitter. Or maybe it was just the taste of my own regret. By mid-afternoon, I realized the chain reaction I had initiated was unstoppable. The phone in my pocket vibrated with a sudden violent intensity. I pulled out Eleanor's device and felt my stomach drop. A blue electronic glare illuminated the screen. Remote wipe attempt in progress. My son wasn't just tracking me anymore. He was trying to execute the evidence from miles away. Before I could even process the digital violation, a heavy shadow blocked the evening sun at my kitchen window, stretching across the tile like a shroud. A car was idling in the driveway, the low rumble vibrating through the floorboards. I looked up and saw the silhouette. Sterling was back standing on the porch, and he wasn't knocking this time. He was already fitting a key into the lock. I shoved Eleanor's phone into the space behind the toaster, my heart doing a frantic tap dance against my ribs as the back door handle began to turn. The back door didn't just open. It yielded to Sterling's key with a proprietary click that reminded me with sickening clarity that I had given him that spare 10 years ago, in a moment of fatherly trust. He stepped into the warm kitchen, bringing with him a gust of winter air and the sharp, clinical scent of expensive, cold cologne. His face was a mask of strained affection, his eyes darting toward the counter where I usually kept my mail. "Dad, David is worried. I'm worried," he began, his voice dipping into that low, practiced timbre he used for grieving clients. "I heard you were obsessing over some old paperwork. I saw you trying to access Mom's phone, and I'll admit I initiated that remote wipe. I was protecting her privacy. She wasn't well at the end, Dad. The medication, the cancer. She was confused. She was seeing things that weren't there." I stood by the island, my knuckles turning white as I gripped the granite edge. The metallic taste of fear-induced dry mouth made it hard to swallow, but my voice remained steady. "Don't you dare use your mother's illness to cover your tracks, Sterling. She saw exactly what you were doing." Sterling paced the kitchen like a trapped predator, the heater humming in the corner, to fill the sharp silences between our sentences. He tried to laugh, but it was a dry, brittle sound. "Dad, you're sitting in the dark with files that don't mean anything. Whatever you think you found, it's just the rambling of a sick woman who lost her grip on reality. I haven't said what I believe yet, Sterling." I replied, my paternal fury rising to meet his arrogance. "But you're already defending yourself against a ghost. How do you reconcile the man standing in your kitchen, threatening your legacy, with the boy you once taught to ride a bike? You don't. You realize the bike was just the first thing he learned to ride away from you on. I know about the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. I know you were weeks away from siphoning my own pension." His facade finally cracked. The false concern vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating anger that made him look like a total stranger. "If you choose these lies over your own blood, you'll lose everything, Dad. Think about Alara. Do you really want her to see her grandfather go through a public breakdown?" His eyes were what chilled me the most. They weren't Eleanor's. They were just empty, like a ledger with the columns wiped clean. I told him flatly to get out. He stared at me for a long moment, then turned on his heel. As he opened the door, he looked back with a sneer. "Romilly and Alara are waiting in the car. I told them we were just dropping off some groceries, but maybe next time I'll tell them the truth about your state of mind." He had used his own daughter as a psychological buffer, knowing I wouldn't dare start a scene with her nearby. I watched the taillights of his SUV disappear down the driveway, the cold handle of the back door still biting into my palm as I locked it. I turned to the window, and my breath hitched. Sterling wasn't the only one who had been watching the house. A black sedan I didn't recognize was idling at the curb, its headlights doused, just a dark shape waiting in the shadows. The black sedan didn't move for 3 minutes. Its headlights extinguished, like the eyes of a predator waiting for the forest to go still before the final spring. I stood behind the frosted glass of the front door, my hand white-knuckled around the cold brass handle. The exhaust from the idling car puffed in the frigid night air, a rhythmic ghost in the darkness. Finally, the driver's side door opened. Corbin Mercer, a 45-year-old fixer with an expensive leather portfolio and shoes that had never seen a Boston slush pile, stood on my porch like a polite wolf. He moved with a practiced feline grace that made the porch floorboards groan under his weight. I opened the door just a crack, the scent of high-end leather and winter ozone slipping into the hallway. "Mr. Garrison," he said, his voice so smooth it felt lubricated with insincerity. "Family matters are like glass once they crack. They're never quite clear again. We're here to help you keep it intact." I didn't invite him in, but he didn't seem to care. He leaned slightly forward, his eyes scanning the hallway behind me. "It's a shame the boxes in your study are causing so much unnecessary friction," he remarked casually. My heart hammered against my ribs. I hadn't told Sterling exactly where I had put the 4 bankers' boxes, yet this man spoke of their location with an eerie certainty. I wondered if they had used thermal imaging from the street, or if someone had slipped in while I was at the cemetery. "I've seen enough snakes in the grass to know when one is wearing a suit, Mr. Mercer," I replied, the taste of copper sharp in the back of my dry throat. "Get to the point." Mercer's smile didn't reach his eyes. He shifted his portfolio, the leather creaking. He looked past me, his gaze landing on the framed photo of Alara hanging in the hall. My Alara, in her tutu. My heart didn't just stop. It turned to lead. "Little Alara is so talented," he murmured. "It would be a tragedy if her grandfather's confusion cost her everything she's worked for." Private schools are very sensitive about the reputation of their families. A public scandal, a messy legal battle, it could shatter her social and educational future. His words were like a slow-acting poison designed to paralyze me with the thought of what I might lose if I fought back. He was telling me that my granddaughter was the collateral for my silence. He wasn't just a lawyer or a consultant. He was a harvester of leverage. Does a son really send a man to threaten his own child's happiness just to save his bank account? The realization brought a white-hot protective rage to the surface, a heat that burned through the chill of the evening. "Get off my porch." "Now," I said, my voice low and vibrating with a resolve I hadn't felt in years. Mercer didn't flinch. He reached into his pocket and produced a card, sliding it toward me. It wasn't for a law firm. It was for a private security group specialized in recovering disputed assets. He looked at me one last time, a silent warning etched into the set of his jaw, before descending the steps with the casual grace of a man who had already won. I watched the exhaust of the sedan as it finally pulled away, and I realized I couldn't wait another minute. I needed to call the only student I ever taught who knew how to fight back. The elevator ride to the 4th floor felt like a descent into a world I had spent 40 years theorizing about, but never expected to inhabit a world where the law was the only thing standing between my son and the people he had devoured. I pressed the cold elevator button with a trembling finger, the metal biting into my skin as the car rose through the gut of downtown Boston. When the door slid open, the air changed, smelling of high-end ink and the heavy, comforting scent of old paper. I carried the first banker's box against my chest like a shield. Sarah Williams's office was a fortress of organized chaos, every surface overflowing with files on elder abuse and financial fraud. Recognition flashed in her eyes the moment I stepped across the threshold. For a brief second, the professional mask of the high-powered attorney slipped, revealing the 17-year-old girl who once sat in the front row of my classroom, debating the ethics of civil disobedience. "Mr. Garrison," she said, her voice steady but carrying a note of profound surprise. "I've been following the Sterling and Associates cases for 18 months. I just didn't expect the help to come from inside the house." She paused, her sharp eyes scanning the heavy box in my arms. I didn't realize until that moment that Eleanor had been sending her encrypted emails under the pseudonym The Librarian for months, providing the very hints that kept Sarah's investigation from being dismissed by the Bar Association. I set the heavy banker's box onto her mahogany desk, the thud echoing through the room like a challenge. "I'm not here as a father today, Sarah," I told her. "I'm here as a witness." We shared a heavy moment of silence, the weight of the betrayal sitting between us like a physical presence. You remember those movies where the hero finds the secret microfilm? This was better. This was 3 years of a mother's heartbreak turned into a weapon of pure mathematical justice. Sarah began to flip through the red folders, her eyes widening as she scanned the original, unaltered contractor invoices Eleanor had painstakingly recovered. My wife had essentially done the discovery work of a 5-year federal investigation in 3 years of quiet, dying resolve. "This is it, mister." Garrison Sarah whispered, her thumb tracing the edge of a document. "This is the ledger that connects Sterling to Gregory Walsh's liquidation accounts. We had been stalled because he successfully lost the paper trail through shell companies. But this is the missing link." She looked at me not as her teacher, but as her client. The world tilted a little further. The sound of a pen clicking with finality punctuated her realization. Eleanor wasn't just hiding. She was hunting. She was brilliant, Sarah added, professional awe softening her gaze. I nodded slowly, the gravity of it all pressing down on me. "She was protecting us," I said. "Now we protect the others." Sarah closed the folder with a sharp snap and reached for her coat, her face hardening into the expression of a woman about to go to war. "Because Sterling forged your signature on those recommendation letters, you have the legal standing of a victim," she explained. "We can initiate an immediate freeze on the firm's domestic assets. It's a move he won't see coming." She stood up the light from the window, catching the iron-set line of her jaw. "There are 12 people waiting at a community center in Dorchester, Mr. Garrison. It's time they saw the face of the man who is going to help them win." The community center smelled of floor wax and stale coffee, a scent that usually signaled a bake sale or a neighborhood watch meeting. But today, it smelled like the last stop for the broken. I followed Sarah into the small basement room, the squeak of my rubber soles on the waxed linoleum floor, echoing like an intruder's footsteps. 12 elderly people sat in a jagged circle of folding chairs, their coats still buttoned against the chill that the clanking radiators in the corner couldn't quite conquer. As Sarah stepped forward to introduce me, the room went deathly silent. I saw the recognition flash across their faces, followed by the jagged edges of resentment. To them, I wasn't the man who had spent 4 decades grading ethics papers. I was the architect of the face that had smiled while it robbed them. Helen Parker, 76, Eleanor's best friend for 30 years, sat in the front row with her hands knotted in her lap, her face a map of the betrayal my son had etched there. "This is Thane Garrison." Sarah said, her voice steady in the low-ceilinged room. "He's the reason we finally have a path forward." "He looks just like him," a woman in the back whispered. I realized with a stabbing pain that 3 of the men here were former students of mine. They hadn't just been random targets. They had specifically sought out Sterling and Associates because they believed a Garrison would always do the right thing. I stood there absorbing their silent accusations, feeling the rough texture of my wool coat as my own hands trembled. Have you ever seen the eyes of a veteran who has lost his home? It's not anger, you see. It's a hollow, echoing sort of bewilderment that makes you want to tear the world apart to fix it. I looked at Thomas Warren, an 81-year-old Korean War veteran, and my student from the early 1960s, who stood with a ramrod-straight spine that defied the weight of his losses. I didn't come here as a grieving husband or a father looking for an excuse. I began my voice, finally finding its center. I came here because my son weaponized my life's work to rob you I can't give you back the years of peace he stole, but I can promise you this. I will be the last person he ever lies to. I didn't blink. I couldn't. I owed them every second of my undivided attention. I saw Thomas Warren's liver-spotted hands tighten on the back of a chair. You taught me honor in 1964, Mr. Garrison, he said, his voice gravelly but firm. I think it's time we taught it to your son. The room shifted, then the collective breath of a dozen people releasing, as the air of victimhood transformed into a unified force of witnesses. I promised them the evidence was secure, and that Sterling's career would be the price for their restoration. As I made my way toward the door, Helen Parker pulled me aside, her eyes wide with a new kind of fear. Thane, wait, she whispered. Sterling came to my apartment 2 days ago. He tried to make me sign a non-disclosure agreement. He offered me a pittance of my savings back if I promised to stay quiet about the New Hampshire project. He told me it was my only chance. I walked out into the biting Dorchester air, the weight of 12 lives pressing against my chest, and realized that Sterling wasn't just hiding money anymore. He was actively hunting the witnesses. The drive to the Boston Globe building was a blur of gray slush, and the burning realization that every minute those boxes stayed in my car was another minute Sterling could destroy them. I gripped the steering wheel of the Camry so hard, my knuckles felt like they were going to burst through the skin, my eyes darting to every black sedan that merged into my lane on the way to Congress Street. The weight of Eleanor's legacy sat heavy in the passenger seat, 4 banker's boxes that held the power to dismantle an empire built on lies. I navigated the dirty slush of the city streets, tasting the stale air and adrenaline of a man who had finally reached his point of no return. When I pulled into the parking area, Sarah was already there, waiting near the entrance with a man who looked like he had been carved out of newsprint and deadline pressure. Michael Rodriguez, an investigative reporter for the Boston Globe in his early 50s, had eyes that looked like they had seen every lie in the city and had stopped being surprised by them a long time ago. We didn't waste time on pleasantries. I hauled the boxes into the newsroom, a hive of controlled chaos that smelled of industrial carpet and the ozone of 100 humming computers. Mr. Garrison, I've been chasing Sterling's shadows for 8 months. Michael said, his voice low and gravelly as we moved toward a private conference room. I hear you brought the light. I set the first box down with a heavy thud. I brought the ledger of his soul, Mr. Rodriguez. I hope your ink is permanent. Michael revealed that he already had a whistleblower from Sterling's firm, a junior associate who had seen too much. But that person had been too terrified to go on the record without physical corroboration. My presence and Eleanor's meticulous files provided the shield they needed. You'd think a newsroom would be loud like in the old movies. It's not. It's a quiet, humming sort of tension, like the sound a hornet makes right before it decides to sting. I watched as Michael began scanning the documents, his professional detachment slowly melting into a focused, predatory intensity. The sound of a digital camera shutter clicking rapidly filled the small room as he preserved the evidence Eleanor had died protecting. He looked up at me, his face grim. You understand, this will end his career, possibly his freedom. He ended those things himself when he started stealing from veterans. I replied, my voice calm but as hard as granite. I'm just providing the period at the end of his sentence. 5 days. Michael needed 5 days to verify the signatures and cross-reference the offshore wire transfers. It felt like he was asking me to hold my breath for a week. As he flipped through the final folder, Michael froze, pointing to a recurring line item. He spotted a series of payments to a private security firm, the same one Corbin Mercer belonged to. Sterling hadn't just been stealing. He had been using the victims' own retirement funds to pay for the goons who were now intimidating them. The betrayal was circular, a snake eating its own tail. I left the newsroom feeling a strange, cold lightness in my hands, having handed over the ammunition for the coming war. I walked out of the Globe building and into the biting wind, But as I reached for my car keys, I noticed a small white envelope tucked under my windshield wiper. There was no stamp, just my name, written in a handwriting I didn't recognize, the paper fluttering against the glass like a warning. The paper of the envelope was cheap, the kind you buy in bulk at a pharmacy, but the words inside were typed with a cold, mechanical precision that made the hair on my arms stand up. Loyalty is a two-way street, Thane. Don't drive off a cliff. I stood frozen in the Congress Street parking lot, the wind whipping the edges of the note against my thumb. I looked around, my eyes darting from the shadows of the concrete pillars to the tinted windows of passing SUVs. He wasn't even hiding it anymore. Sterling was watching me, tracking my every move through the city, like I was a mark he was preparing to liquidate. I climbed into my Toyota Camry, but before I started the engine, I felt a sudden sharp instinct to check the wheel well. My fingers brushed against a small magnetic plastic case tucked into the undercarriage. A GPS tracker. Corbin Mercer had been following me to every secret meeting with Sarah and Michael, documenting the very betrayal I was trying to keep in the shadows. I ripped the device free and crushed it under my heel, the plastic snapping with a satisfying crunch. I retreated to my home, locking every door and window, as if the deadbolts could keep out the rot Sterling had introduced to our name. For 5 days, the house became a tomb of my own making. The dry, stale taste of a house that hasn't been aired out in days coated my tongue, a reminder of my isolation. The phone rang incessantly, the jarring electric shrill echoing off the walls of the kitchen. Sterling called. Romilly called. I watched their names flash on the screen and let the silence take them. I spent the long hours staring at my wedding photo, writing a letter to Alara that I wasn't sure I would ever have the courage to send. "I'm doing this for your future, Alara," I wrote, my pen shaking. "Even if you hate me for it today. Justice often requires the hardest kind of love, the kind that cuts through bone to save the soul. Have you ever sat in a house you've lived in for 40 years and felt like a prisoner? The walls didn't change, but the safety did. It evaporated like mist. Before I reveal the conversation that finally brings the hammer down on that envelope's warning, if you are still with me, I want to hear your perspective. Comment right if you think I am being a righteous father, or wrong if you think I am being a vengeful one, and add one short reason why so I can understand how you see this moral choice. Please note, the next part contains some dramatized details added for narrative impact to convey the depth of the moment. The message behind this story is what I hope stays with you. Silence. Absolute heavy silence. Then the phone screamed. I sat in the dark kitchen. The blue, hypnotic flicker of the computer monitor, the only light in the room as rain tapped rhythmically against the glass. It was 6 a.m. I picked up the receiver, my sweaty palm sliding against the cold plastic. It was Michael Rodriguez. "It's done, Mr. Garrison," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who hadn't slept. "We go live in 1 hour." He told me that Sterling's firm had tried to file a preemptive gag order injunction against the Globe at 3 a.m., a desperate legal maneuver that had ultimately failed. The verification was complete. "God help us all, Michael," I whispered. I sat at the kitchen table with my finger hovering over the refresh button on the Globe's website, knowing that in 60 minutes, the son I raised would become the man I destroyed. The clock on the microwave hit 7 a.m., and as I clicked refresh, the digital world didn't just wake up. It caught fire, incinerating 41 years of my son's carefully crafted lies in a single, high-definition headline. The blue electronic hum of the laptop seemed to grow louder as the Boston Globe homepage loaded. There it was, dominating the screen, respected educator's son, accused of defrauding elderly clients. Evidence compiled by late wife. I scanned the sharp clinical prose of Michael Rodriguez. He had laid it all bare, from the $3.7 million theft to the calculated weaponization of the Garrison name. I felt a nauseating mixture of vindication for Eleanor and absolute grief for the man Sterling used to be. The article even revealed that Eleanor had sent a duplicate copy of the evidence to a rival law firm 3 weeks before she died. She was thorough. She had ensured that even if one path was blocked, the truth would still find the light. "It's out there, Elle," I whispered, staring at the screen through a thin veil of tears. "No one can bury it now." By 8:15 a.m., the smell of scorched toast lingered in the kitchen, forgotten, as the comment section under the article transformed into a tidal wave of public outrage. Former students and Boston residents were flooding the site with shock and fury. Have you ever watched a building being demolished? It happens so fast. Decades of construction turned into a cloud of dust in seconds. That was my son's life at 8:15 this morning. I moved to the living room and turned on the television. A live news feed showed a swarm of reporters gathered outside Sterling's glass-fronted office in the Seaport district. Their cameras pointed at the entrance like bayonets. A scrolling ticker at the bottom of the screen announced that Sterling and Associates had released a statement placing him on immediate leave. 2 senior partners had already resigned, citing a total loss of institutional trust. I sat on the edge of the sofa watching the bright, clinical white of the newsroom backdrop as an anchor interviewed a spokesperson from the Massachusetts Bar Association. "A total loss of trust," I whispered, repeating the anchor's words. "That's what you were always afraid of, Sterling. Not the crime, but the being caught." The phone on the counter began to vibrate with aggressive persistence. Then the landline. Then the laptop chimed. The world was screaming for an answer I wasn't ready to give. The FBI and the Bar Association issued a joint statement confirming formal investigations. The collapse was absolute. Just then, a local station aired a pre-recorded rebuttal from Gregory Walsh, Sterling's longtime partner. He didn't hesitate. He flipped instantly, looking directly into the camera to blame the entire scheme on Sterling's personal greed and forged documents. He was throwing Sterling to the wolves to save his own skin. I looked at the screen as the Bar Association announced a permanent ethics inquiry, but my breath hitched when a car door slammed in my driveway with a violent, echoing thud. I looked through the blinds. It wasn't the black sedan this time. It was Sterling's high-performance SUV, and the engine was still screaming, idling roughly, as if the machine itself shared the driver's frantic, shattered rage. I stood my ground, my heart hammering against my ribs, as I realized the polite portion of this tragedy had officially ended. The back door didn't just open. It slammed against the radiator with a violence that rattled the copper pipes throughout the house. And there stood Sterling, his silk tie loosened like a noose, and his eyes wild with the frantic energy of a cornered animal. The sound of the key in the lock wasn't tentative this time. It was a violent metallic intrusion that announced the end of any civility. I stood by the kitchen island, watching him storm into the room, smelling the sour tang of his sweat, mixed with the scent of stale, cold coffee. His face, usually so perfectly composed for the courtrooms and cameras, was a mess of jagged lines, a bead of sweat tracing a path through the light makeup he had applied to hide his lack of sleep. "You chose them, Dad." He screamed, his voice cracking as it hit the low ceiling. "You chose those relics over me. You just burned Ilara's future to the ground. You've destroyed everything!" I stood my ground, absorbing the impact of his words, while the floorboards beneath my feet seemed to vibrate with his pacing. I didn't tell him that Romilly had already called me sobbing as she packed her bags to take Ilara to her sister's house, her personal world collapsing even faster than the firm in the Seaport district. My son was a hollowed-out tree, and the first strong wind of consequence was finally bringing him down. "No, Sterling," I said, my voice low and steady. "I chose the truth. You're the one who provided the matches. I haven't done anything but honor your mother's final wish. She spent her last days documenting your crimes because she loved you enough to want you stopped. Have you ever heard the sound of a man's soul breaking? It's not a snap. It's a high, thin whine like wind through a cracked window. Sterling's narcissism was so complete that he couldn't even see the wreckage he had caused for others. He only saw the loss of his own standing. He lunged across the kitchen, reaching for my pocket, as if he could somehow claw back the original phone or the folders. I didn't flinch. I was a mountain, and he was just a storm that had run out of rain. The FBI has the originals, Sterling. The Globe is already printing the second part. The game is over. His rage hit a wall, and then it simply crumbled into a pathetic, whimpering plea. "Dad, please. If you just say you found them in her trash, that she was confused, I can fix this. We can say the medications made her see shadows where there were none. I taught ethics for 40 years, Sterling. I won't start lying now to save a thief." I turned my back on him, then the silence of the house thick enough to choke on. Sterling's silk-clothed frame seemed to shrink under the weight of my judgment, and for a fleeting second, I saw the boy I had failed to really know. He stumbled back toward the door, his movements disjointed. As he fumbled with his car keys, he accidentally dropped a burner phone onto the floor, the device sliding across the tile with a light clatter. I watched him slam the back door with finality, but my eyes stayed glued to the burner phone on the floor. The screen still glowing with a recent text from Gregory Walsh threatening to kill Sterling if he spoke to the FBI. The burner phone sat on my kitchen table like a live grenade, its rhythmic chirping a reminder that while the public scandal was peaking, the real danger was just beginning to crawl out from the shadows. The silence that followed Sterling's departure was louder than any of his screaming, broken only by that persistent electronic chirp. I didn't touch it with my bare hands. I called Sarah Williams immediately, and within the hour, federal agents were in my kitchen. I watched the grim sound of the FBI evidence bag zipping shut, a sharp plastic finality that felt like the closing of a heavy chapter. Sarah stood by the counter, her expression grim but determined. "He's safer in a cell than on the street." "Sarah," I said, my voice heavy with a new kind of exhaustion. "That's the irony of it. The FBI is tracking Walsh now." "Thane," she told me, placing a hand on my arm. "We're moving into the long game." The entry into that long game was brutal. I soon discovered through Sarah that Sterling hadn't stopped his assault. He was attempting to use Eleanor's medical records to argue she was mentally incompetent, essentially trying to sue his own mother's estate from behind bars to invalidate the evidence she had left for me. It was a final, desperate act of betrayal that hardened the last soft corners of my heart. 8 months is a long time to hold your breath. You eventually forget what it feels like to have lungs that don't burn with the weight of expectation. My home became a fortress of solitude. I spent the spring and the long, tense summer in the garden Eleanor had planted. The tactile sensation of dirt under my fingernails, the only thing that kept me anchored to the earth while the lawyers fought their wars. I didn't lose my friends. I just found out who they never were. The Garrison name became a pariah in the elite circles where we once belonged. But I found solace in the quiet letters of support that arrived from former students. They remembered the ethics teacher. They didn't care about the scandal. I spent my days in a meditative peace waiting as Sarah built a massive civil case to seek restitution for the 20 victims Sterling had devoured. October came with a bite, the same bite Eleanor's voice had when she spoke about justice. The air turned crisp, the smell of damp autumn leaves beginning to coat the streets of Boston. Just days before the trial was set to begin, I received a package. Inside was a single handwritten note from Romilly. It was a confession of her own. She had been cooperating with the FBI for months, providing the passwords to the encrypted files Eleanor couldn't crack. It was the final nail in the coffin. I pulled on the heavy wool suit I hadn't worn since the funeral, the fabric feeling like armor. I exited my car at the courthouse, the blinding flash of news cameras temporarily obscuring my vision as I navigated the steps. I adjusted my tie in the reflection of the courthouse's brass doors, realizing that while Sarah had the files, I was the only person in Boston who could look Sterling in the eye and tell him why he had already lost. The oak doors of courtroom 4B swung shut with a heavy final thud, cutting off the frantic shouts of the press and leaving me in a chamber that smelled of floor wax, old law books, and the impending death of my son's freedom. I took my seat in the gallery, the tactile hardness of the wooden pew under my thighs, providing a grounding reality against the surreal clinical glow of the overhead lights. Blindingly white light reflected off the judge's bench as the morning session commenced. Across the aisle, I could see the back of Sterling's neck. He sat rigid, his expensive suit fitting him like armor. I watched him closely and noticed a chilling detail. His pen was moving rapidly, but he wasn't tracking the legal arguments. He was scribbling a list of liquid assets accounts he clearly still had, hidden in the shadows, already planning his financial survival. There was no bowed head, no sign of the remorse I had hoped for in my most private prayers. Sarah Williams rose and called the first witness. Helen Parker moved to the stand, her rhythmic creak of the witness chair echoing in the sudden hush. She looked so frail, clutching a damp handkerchief, as she recounted how Sterling had sat in her living room, drinking her tea, while convincing her to sign over the equity of the home she'd lived in for 30 years. She described the shame of the day the sheriff arrived, the humiliation of moving her life into her daughter's spare basement room. I didn't think I was signing a contract. Helen sobbed, her voice barely a whisper. I thought I was helping Robert's boy. Sarah asked if he had ever mentioned the risks. No, she whispered. He told me it was as safe as a garrison's word. How do you put a price on the dignity of an 80-year-old woman? Is it the cost of the house she lost? Or the cost of the sleep she'll never get back? I felt the weight of her words like stones in my pockets. Next came Thomas Warren. His Korea veteran cap rested on the railing, and I could smell the faint scent of peppermint on his breath as he spoke. He didn't sob. He testified with a voice that graveled with suppressed rage. He explained that the $220,000 Sterling stole was his life's disability compensation and the inheritance saved for his grandchildren. I bled for this country for 30 years of payments, and that boy took it all with a smile and a fountain pen, he declared. He turned then, looking directly at Sterling. You aren't just a thief's son. You're a coward who hides behind a good man's name. The room went cold, not from the air conditioning, but from the realization that we were breathing the same air as a monster. The sharp metallic click of the court reporter's keys was the only sound in the stunned silence that followed. But the silence didn't last. Sterling's lead defense attorney stood up for the cross-examination, his eyes cold and opportunistic. He pointed a shaking finger toward the gallery, specifically at my seat. He began to imply that Thomas had only invested because I had personally vouched for the funds in private phone calls. I felt the entire courtroom turn toward me as the lawyer demanded to know exactly how much I had known about my son's family business before the first dollar disappeared. The walk from the gallery to the witness stand felt like a mile of burning coals, each step a final rhythmic goodbye to the son I had tried to love for 41 years. I climbed the small wooden steps, the rhythmic sound of the court reporter's typing hitting my ears like a mechanical heartbeat. As I placed my hand on the Bible, the cold, smooth grain of the witness stand felt like the only solid thing in a world made of vapor. I swore the oath, my voice steady despite the crushing weight in my chest. I looked directly at Sterling. He was slumped in his chair, a shadow of the polished man who had arrived this morning, and he refused to meet my eyes. Sarah Williams stood, her face a mask of professional resolve. Mr. Garrison, did you ever consent to your son claiming you were a partner in these investments? She asked. No, I replied, and the word felt like it was carved from stone. He didn't just use my name, Sarah. He stole it. He used a lifetime of my students' trust as collateral for a crime. To drive the point home, I produced a small digital recorder I had pulled from Eleanor's hidden cache. one that Sarah hadn't even entered into evidence yet. I pressed play, and the courtroom filled with Sterling's voice laughing as he told Gregory Walsh that I was too senile to notice the signature forgeries. The smell of old paper and heavy courtroom air seemed to thicken as the recording played. Sterling's shoulders began to tremble, and he finally dropped his head into his hands. Have you ever had to perform an autopsy on your own family? That's what it felt like. Each question was a scalpel peeling back the skin of our life to show the rot beneath. Sterling's defense lawyer attempted a brutal cross-examination, his voice dripping with feigned sympathy as he suggested I was merely a vengeful, grieving widower looking for a scapegoat. You are a teacher, Mr. Garrison. Do you not teach forgiveness? He challenged. I took a slow breath, the taste of salt from a single unintended tear hitting my lip. Forgiveness requires the truth first, counselor. My son hasn't even looked at the people he robbed yet. Character is revealed not in the words we say, but in how we treat the vulnerable. I looked at Sterling one last time, not as his father, as his judge. Honor means facing consequences, Sterling. I said, my voice carrying to every corner of the room. It doesn't mean hiding behind your father's shadow or your mother's grave. Sterling finally broke a low sob escaping him that was lost in the sudden murmur of the gallery. The tragedy of the moment was absolute, a final victory that felt like a burial. As I stepped down from the stand, my legs felt like lead, but my spirit was strangely light. The judge adjusted her glasses and looked at the U.S. attorney seated in the front row. Based on the testimony and the audio evidence presented today, she said, her voice like a hammer, I am referring this matter to the U.S. attorney for immediate criminal indictment. I am also ordering an immediate freeze on all assets mentioned in the new recordings. Sterling looked up as the judge mentioned the U.S. attorney. And for the first time in his life, the arrogant mask was gone, replaced by the sheer hollow terror of a man who realized the ground had finally disappeared. The 2-day wait for the jury was a different kind of silence than the funeral. It was the silence of a house where the fire had finally been put out, but only the ash remained. I spent those 48 hours in my study staring at the empty space where the boxes had once been, feeling the phantom weight of my wife's resolve pressing against my chest. When the call finally came, I drove to the courthouse with a hollow stomach. The silence of a jury returning is unlike any other. It's a pressurized vacuum that sucks the air out of the room, leaving you to drown in the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock until the foreperson clears their throat. I took my usual seat in courtroom 4B, the tactile sensation of the smooth, worn wood of the courtroom pew beneath my palms, providing a thin tether to reality. Sterling was already there, his face ashen and gray, his shoulders slumped, as if the very air in the room had become lead. As the jury filed in, I noticed a subtle professional betrayal. The moment the foreperson stood, Sterling's high-priced defense attorney leaned away, handed him a final invoice, and resigned on the spot right there in front of the judge. It was a cold signal that my son's retainers had finally run dry, and the legal vultures were already flapping away to find fresh meat. We fined for the plaintiffs in the total amount of $2.8 million. The foreperson read their voice, clear and clinical. A collective heavy intake of breath swept through the gallery. Behind me, I heard a ragged sob from Helen Parker. It's not just the money, Robert, she whispered through her tears when the judge paused for the record. He's finally been told no. Sterling didn't move. He stared at the defense table, his face a mask of gray stone, as the weight of the financial ruin was codified by the court. Have you ever seen a man realize he's no longer the architect of his own life? It's not the fear you expect. It's a sudden, terrifying stillness, like a bird realizing the sky has turned to glass. The judge adjusted her glasses, her voice cutting through the smell of floor wax and cedar wood. She formally recommended Sterling's permanent disbarment and confirmed that the U.S. attorney had issued a warrant for his arrest, based on the criminal evidence I had provided. Mr. Garrison, you should expect a criminal sentence of 5 to 7 years. Take him into custody. The bailiffs moved in with a practiced, predatory speed. Click, click. The sound of those handcuffs will haunt the rest of my days. Sterling's wrists were snapped into the steel, the mechanical sound, marking the final period at the end of our family history. Dad. His voice was a small, high-pitched ghost of the boy who once asked for help with his homework, not a grown man who had systematically devoured his neighbors. He gave me one final broken look as he was led toward the back door, and I realized he wasn't looking for a pardon. He was looking for a person who no longer existed in his life. Just as the bailiffs lead him out, I noticed a man in a dark suit in the back of the room who wasn't press or law enforcement. It was Gregory Walsh's legal representative, signaling that the war between the conspirators was just moving to a different theater. I remained seated in the empty gallery long after the lights were dimmed, my hand still gripping the wooden pew, realizing that while the monster was caged, the victims were still homeless, and I was the only one left with a roof I didn't deserve. The porch of my house felt like a stranger's doorstep a week later, when a shadow I'd spent months avoiding finally knocked on the door, bringing with it the scent of rainy pavement and the heavy silence of a family in ruins. I pulled the door open to find Romilly Garrison, my daughter-in-law, standing there without her usual designer armor. Her eyes were rimmed with red, and her shoulders slumped under the weight of a reality she could no longer ignore. The smell of damp wool and cold rain clung to her, a sharp contrast to the low, persistent hum of the refrigerator in the empty house behind me. I noticed her chipped nail polish, a tiny jarring sign of her total collapse. "I didn't know Thane," she whispered, as I led her into the kitchen. "I swear I didn't know he was capable of using your name like that." She broke down over a cup of tea I'd brewed more out of habit than hospitality. She admitted she had been blinded by the lifestyle, the vacations, and the seaport office, never asking where the money came from. But then she dropped a detail that made the tea turn to ash in my mouth. Just days before the Globe story broke, Sterling had attempted to take out a second mortgage on this very house using another forged signature. He was ready to leave me homeless, to buy himself another month of luxury. I looked at her, seeing the raw vulnerability in her face. "I don't hate you, Romilly," I said quietly. "But Alara needs the truth, even if it's heavy." She told me the girl was struggling, asking why her father was in a bad place and why her grandpa didn't visit anymore. I realized then that while I had won the legal battle, the family landscape was a scorched earth of collateral damage. Have you ever looked at a balance sheet and realized that your entire life's work, every mortgage payment, every saved penny, was just a rounding error in a criminal's ledger? A few weeks later, Sarah Williams arrived with a court-appointed accountant. We sat in the living room, the tactile dryness of the paper spreadsheets rustling as they laid out the brutal math of restitution. The news was crushing. After liquidating Sterling's secret accounts, the cars, and the firm's remaining assets, they only had $1.2 million. "There's a shortfall of $1.5 million, Mr. Garrison," Sarah said, her voice carrying a professional sadness. "We've reached the bottom of Sterling's pockets." The ink on the paper was black. The numbers were red. My future was gray. The $3.7 million total loss meant that people like Helen Parker and Thomas Warren would remain destitute despite the victory in courtroom 4B. "So they won the case, but they still lose their lives?" I asked, my voice rising. "That's not ethics, Sarah. That's just a different kind of theft." Then the accountant pointed to a clause in the firm's structure. Because Sterling had used the Garrison name as a primary asset and forged my backing, the victim's lawyers were technically entitled to place a lien on my own house to cover the remaining debt. My son hadn't just stolen from strangers. He had legally tethered my roof to his crimes. I looked at the house Eleanor and I had built over 45 years, and for the first time, I didn't see a home. I saw a pile of lumber and brick that belonged to the people my son had robbed. The decision didn't come in a flash of lightning. It arrived in the quiet clicking of my heater, a sound I realized 20 other families might never hear again unless I turned my home into their restitution. I spent the afternoon wandering through the rooms, the smell of beeswax polish and old books following me like the scent of a life nearly finished. I stopped at the kitchen doorframe, tracing the faint pencil marks where I had measured Sterling's height every year until he turned 18. Further down there were smaller marks for Alara. My fingers lingered on the kitchen tiles Eleanor had picked out 30 years ago, her face still clear in my mind as she argued for a specific shade of Mediterranean blue. I calculated the equity with a cold academic detachment, realizing the Boston market had soared enough that the sale would cover the $1.5 million shortfall almost exactly. It's just wood and plaster. I whispered to the empty hallway, the visual of the setting sun casting long orange shadows across the living room carpet. The memories aren't in the walls. I felt a sharp pang of guilt for erasing Alara's future inheritance. But I overridden it with the ethical imperative that had guided my career: stolen lives must be repaid before legacies can be built. While preparing for the move, I opened the small safe in my study and found a hidden velvet pouch in the very back. Inside was a stash of Eleanor's finest jewelry, but what stopped my heart was the stack of appraisal papers clipped to them. She had already prepared for this. My wife had planned to sell her own history to fund the fight against Sterling, if her investigation ever came to light while she was still alive. She had been ready to strip herself bare for the truth. What is a home once the family that filled it is gone? Is it a sanctuary, or just a very expensive museum of everything you've lost? I invited Sarah Williams over that evening to finalize the logistics. We sat at the cold granite kitchen island, the sound of the furnace kicking on in the basement puncturing the heavy silence. She was visibly moved, her professional mask slipping, as she warned me that at 70, starting over in a small apartment would be grueling. "You're giving up everything you have left, Mr. Garrison," she said, her voice soft. "No, Sarah," I replied, my hand steady as I reached for the documents. "I'm finally paying the debt I didn't know I owed. It's the first time I've felt like an honest man in months." The pen felt heavy. Heavier than the boxes. Heavier than the truth. I pressed the nib to the page, the sharp scratching sound of the pen on the legal document marking the end of my life as a homeowner. As I signed the listing agreement, a strange, light-headed sense of freedom washed over me. As Sarah packed her bag, she told me that the victims, led by Thomas Warren, had initially discussed refusing the restitution if it meant I lost my house. She told me she had to convince them that allowing me this act of honor was the only way I would ever find peace. I handed the signed contract to Sarah, but as she reached for her bag, she froze, her eyes glued to the evening news on the small kitchen television, where a familiar face was being escorted out of a federal building in a different city. The echoes of my footsteps in the empty hallway sounded like a dialogue between the man I used to be and the stranger I had become, each hollow thud resonating against walls that no longer held my name. I moved through the stripped rooms of the Garrison home, witnessing the pale rectangles on the walls where family photos once hung like icons of a life I thought was solid. Now those spaces were just shadows. I carried a single small box of essentials, Eleanor's letters, a few of my most worn ethics texts, and the tablet from the storage unit. I stopped at the kitchen island one last time, the cold granite a familiar anchor under my palm. The morning news had been a frantic staccato, but the core of it was peace. Gregory Walsh's arrest hadn't just been a local headline. His testimony had directly implicated 3 other law firms, turning my son's betrayal into the catalyst for a massive citywide legal purge. More importantly, Walsh's cowardice had led to the recovery of several million more in overseas assets. The victims wouldn't just be settled, they would be more than whole. "We did it, Elle," I whispered to the empty air. "They're safe now." I walked to the front door, the heavy wood clicking shut for the last time with a sound of absolute finality. Goodbye to the ghosts. A house is just a heavy garment we wear to prove we exist. Taking it off felt like the first deep breath after a year of drowning. I drove away from the tree-lined street, the Camry's suspension lightened by the lack of boxes, and headed toward a modest studio apartment near the university. When I arrived, the smell of fresh paint and empty space greeted me. It was a fraction of the size of the house I'd spent 45 years maintaining. But as I turned the smooth, cold metal of the new apartment key in the lock, I felt an overwhelming sense of lightness. I began to unpack, moving with a steady, quiet deliberation. I set Eleanor's framed photo on the small built-in desk by the window. The visual of the snow-dusted Boston skyline through the small pane was enough to make my chest swell with a quiet, somber triumph. I had bought myself a future unburdened by Sterling's shadows paid for in wood and brick. I brewed a cup of hot, simple tea in a new mug and sat by the window, the blue, hypnotic flicker of the city lights reflecting off the dark glass. It's enough, I thought, watching the first flakes of a winter storm begin to swirl. More than enough. One key, one room, one truth. I was finally home. As I opened the last box at the bottom of the stack, I found a small hand-drawn card that Romilly must have slipped in while I wasn't looking. It was from Alara. There were colorful drawings of flowers and a single sentence in her messy 6-year-old script. "Thank you for telling the truth, even when it was hard." I held the paper with trembling fingers, feeling the first warm sign of a restored bridge to my granddaughter. The ethics teacher had finally passed his own final exam, proving that honor is a currency that never truly depreciates. The silence of my new world was deep and restful, but it was suddenly broken by the familiar chime of a new email from Sarah Williams. The cursor blinked on the screen, a tiny white pulse in the dim light of the studio, waiting for me to engage with the world one last time. The knock was hesitant, 3 soft raps that barely carried over the whistle of the January wind against the studio's thin glass, sounding more like a question than a demand. I stood in the center of my new, cramped world, the smell of cheap apartment hallway cleaner clinging to the air. I had opened Sarah Williams's email only minutes before. She had warned me that David was looking for my new address, proving that my former student was still acting as my protective vanguard even now when the war was technically over. I pulled the door open. David Morrison stood there looking aged and diminished by the weight of his own guilt. He looked like a man who had lost his way in a blizzard. We sat in the kitchen area of the studio, our knees nearly touching in the small space. David clutched a paper coffee cup with trembling hands, the steam rising between us, to fill the silence of months of unspoken betrayal. "I didn't think he'd use it against you, Robert," he said, his voice a ragged whisper. "I thought I was saving you from your own grief. I thought if Sterling knew you were spiraling, he could help." I listened with a detachment that surprised me. The heat of my anger had long since evaporated, replaced by the cold clarity of consequence. "Intentions don't pay for empty houses, David." I replied, my hand resting on the cold, laminate countertop. "But they do weigh down the soul. Is forgiveness a gift you give to the person who hurt you, or is it just the trash you take out, so your own house doesn't smell like rot?" I looked at my friend of 50 years, and saw a stranger wearing a familiar face. David begged for forgiveness, offering to help me with my new living expenses, or even move back to his neighborhood so we could be near each other again. I gently refused. This studio and the sacrifice of the house were necessary for my own moral equilibrium. I couldn't live a lie in a mansion. "Can we ever go back to how it was?" David asked, his eyes wet. "We can go forward, David. But the landscape has changed. You'll find me here, but you won't find the man you used to know." He cried, then the sound thick and ugly in the quiet room. He cried. I didn't. I had run out of tears somewhere between the storage unit and the courthouse. Just before he rose to leave, David delivered the final blow of the morning. Margaret had left him. She couldn't live with the shame of her role in the leak, or the way it had fractured our circle. Sterling's ripples were still destroying lives, even from a prison cell, proving that some poisons never truly leave the water. I walked him to the door and watched him descend the stairs, his shoulders hunched. The heavy apartment door clicked shut with a sound of absolute finality. I realized then that some bridges once burned to save a life can never be crossed again, even if the fire is out. I watched David's car pull away from the curb through the window, but my eyes were already drifting to the small, white envelope on the counter, the final instructions Eleanor had left for the day I was truly alone. I reached for it, my fingers steady, as I prepared for the last conversation I would ever have with my wife. I didn't use a letter opener. I used my thumb to tear the seal of Eleanor's final envelope. The sound of the paper parting, like the last cord connecting me to a life that had been systematically dismantled. The paper was aged, the adhesive already brittle, as if it had been waiting decades for this specific moment of silence. I sat on the edge of my small bed in the studio, the whistle of the winter wind through the window seals providing a lonely accompaniment to her written voice. Thane, an ethics teacher without a classroom, is just a man with a heavy conscience, she had written in those final weeks. Go back to work. Teach them how to spot the wolves. She revealed a modest life insurance policy from her early teaching days that I had never known existed. But there was a catch. Eleanor had placed it in a trust that required me to be unburdened by property to access it. She had predicted my decision to sell the house long before I even knew I would have to. She didn't want me to just survive the scandal. She was planning my resurrection. She knew that to truly honor the social contract, I had to be back at the podium, turning my grief into a practical shield for others. Retirement is a slow rust, but teaching is a whetstone. I could feel the dull edges of my mind beginning to spark against the curiosity of the room as I prepared for my first day. I arrived at the Dorchester Community Center on a crisp February morning, carrying the heavy leather briefcase handle that felt like an old friend in my grip. Sarah Williams had worked tirelessly to help me establish the Garrison Initiative. As I entered the small classroom, I was greeted by the eager, weathered faces of Helen Parker and Thomas Warren. They were no longer just victims in a legal file. They were my first students. The rhythmic sound of the radiator clanking in the corner felt like a heartbeat. Good morning, I said, setting my briefcase down and taking a sip of lukewarm thermos coffee. My name is Thane Garrison, and today we're going to talk about the fine print of the social contract. It's good to have you back at the front of the room. Professor Thomas said, his voice firm and full of a new kind of respect. You think a classroom is just four walls and a desk? No. It's a laboratory where we figure out how to live without breaking one another. It is the place where we rebuild the trust that men like my son tried to incinerate. As I began to write on the board, the dry, familiar scent of chalk dust filled my lungs, a perfume of purpose. I noticed Sarah Williams standing in the back of the room. She wasn't holding a legal pad. She was holding a stack of syllabus outlines. She wasn't there as my attorney, but as a guest lecturer, revealing that our partnership had evolved into a systemic effort to change the very state laws that had allowed Sterling to flourish for so long. We were no longer just reacting to a crime. We were building a fortress. I picked up a piece of white chalk, its dust coating my fingers like the memories of 40 years, and I realized that while Sterling was behind bars, I was the one who had finally been set free. I was no longer the father of a thief or the widower of a ghost. I was a teacher again. The community center hallway was a tunnel of flickering fluorescent light and silence until a small, familiar shadow detached itself from the vending machine alcove and called my name in a voice that trembled with more than just the winter cold. I froze my keys mid-turn in the classroom lock. Ilara, my 10-year-old granddaughter, with Eleanor's inquisitive eyes and a jawline that suggested she was already tired of being lied to, stood there clutching her backpack like a shield. The smell of damp wool and cold winter air clung to her coat, and her hands were red-chapped from the biting wind outside. She explained through chattering teeth that she had taken 2 buses and walked 6 blocks to find me because her mother, Romilly, had been crying for days and wouldn't tell her why I was the bad guy in the news. I brought her into the warm classroom, the heater's metallic rattle the only sound in the empty building. A fierce protectiveness overrode my exhaustion. "Grandpa, they said you put Daddy in a cage," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "They said you took our house." I knelt beside her, rubbing her cold hands. "Sweetheart, houses are just boxes." I took the lies away so we could breathe again. She looked at me for a long moment, then revealed that Sterling had been visiting her secretly before his arrest, telling her I was confused and that she shouldn't trust my stories. He had been trying to poison the next generation before the law could catch him. She was so small, so fragile, and yet she had carried the heaviest secret in the city in a sparkly pink backpack. Ilara reached into her bag and pulled out a crinkled violet-colored envelope. She explained it was taped behind a loose baseboard in her old playroom where she and Eleanor used to hide treasure. "Grandma said if I found this, it meant the game was over and we were safe," she said, her voice gaining a tiny bit of strength. I recognized Eleanor's handwriting immediately. There was a post-it note attached, instructing Ilara to give it to me if I ever moved into a smaller world. My wife was always 3 steps ahead of the dark, wasn't she? Eleanor's handwriting was a bridge made of ink reaching across the grave to pull us both back from the edge of the collapse. Inside the violet envelope was a letter addressed to Ilara, but taped to the bottom of the page was a cold silver key. Eleanor wrote that she had funded a safe deposit box with her own grandmother's inheritance, a private cache, separate from any joint garrison assets. She had kept it hidden for 40 years, waiting for the moment when the foundation finally rotted away. I felt the tactile sensation of the cold metal against my thumb, the violet hue of the envelope shimmering under the harsh classroom light. I realized then that Eleanor hadn't just left me a mission to stop a thief. She had left one final, impossible truth that was about to change everything I thought I knew about our son's birth. The silver key felt heavier than the boxes of evidence, a cold weight that seemed to vibrate with the frequency of a secret kept for 4 decades. I looked at the key and then at the girl who had brought it to me, realizing that the real reason Eleanor was so desperate to stop Sterling was hidden behind a bank vault door I didn't even know existed. I pulled Ilara closer, the scent of the winter air still clinging to her hair, while the violet envelope sat between us on the laminate desk, like a small paper heart waiting to be revived. The classroom was an island of dim yellow light in the vast silence of the Dorchester Center. I began to read the letter aloud, my voice catching on Eleanor's elegant looping script. She revealed a secret she had guarded for over 4 decades, one that made the very air in the room feel heavy with the weight of old ghosts. Sterling was not my biological son. During our brief, intense separation early in our marriage, Eleanor had a short encounter with a man I never knew existed. She chose me to be the father because of what she called my inherent goodness. "I chose your grandfather not because of a bloodline, Ilara, but because of his soul," she wrote. "I wanted Sterling to grow in the light of an honest man." The revelation was an existential shock, a sudden shifting of the earth beneath my feet. But the letter went deeper. The man who had fathered Sterling was a person Eleanor had investigated in her youth for high-level financial misconduct. She had spent 40 years searching Sterling's face for the rot of a generational echo, a dark strain she feared was inevitable. "Thane, if you are reading this, forgive me for the silence," her words pleaded from the crinkled page. "I thought my love could drown out the ghost of a man you never knew. Can a secret be a kindness? Or is it just a debt we leave for the people we love to pay after we're gone?" I didn't feel betrayed. I felt seen. She had spent 40 years protecting my image of our life, even while she was bracing for the collapse she feared was written in Sterling's marrow. Ilara gripped my hand, her small fingers warm against my palm. Grandpa, am I going to be like him? She asked, her voice a fragile thread. I looked at her, realizing she had been carrying the unspoken terror of her father's bad blood. Look at me, Alara. You have her heart, and you have my name. The rest of the world, that's just noise. You are your own beginning. I used the final pages of the letter addressed directly to her to explain that biology is just a map, not a destination. Eleanor had ensured this by leaving the silver key in our possession. The safe deposit box it opened was explicitly for Alara's education, a clean legacy untethered from Sterling's stolen millions. As the winter wind rattled the high classroom windows, I felt the cold, metallic bite of the silver key in my palm. The letter revealed one last detail. The box didn't just contain money. Eleanor had recorded a video testimonial for Alara before the cancer took her voice, a primary source of truth meant to guide her when the world got loud. I folded the violet paper, the fading scent of her stationery, a ghost in the room. I didn't feel like the victim of a lie. I felt like the recipient of a final, desperate protection. We sat together in the dimming light, a grandfather and granddaughter finally untethered from the shame that had threatened to consume us. I tucked the key into my pocket, knowing the journey wasn't over until we saw what Eleanor had captured on that final hidden tape. A year is enough time for the grass to reclaim a disturbed patch of earth, but it's barely a heartbeat when you're waiting for the echoes of a family's collapse to finally fade into the Boston wind. I stood before Eleanor's headstone at Mount Auburn Cemetery, my palm resting on the smooth, cool marble. The smell of dry leaves and cold stone filled the air, a seasonal reminder of things passing and things enduring. The wind whistled through the ancient elms, carrying the crisp, clean taste of October. I was there to deliver my final report. The folders are closed, Eli whispered. The debt is paid in full. I told her about the others. Helen Parker had finally settled into a bright, safe apartment near the park. And Thomas Warren had just called me to say his oldest granddaughter had started her freshman year at the university. I informed her that the mission she set in motion within that dusty storage unit was complete. The Garrison name no longer stood for a predator's greed. It had become a shield for the vulnerable. I reflected on Sterling's current life in that minimum security facility. I felt no fire of vengeance, only the quiet sorrow of an ethics teacher observing a failed experiment. You spend your life teaching that the truth sets you free. You just never realize how much of yourself you have to burn to make the fire bright enough to see by. I had heard through Sarah that Sterling had started a small ethics study group behind bars using my old discarded textbooks. I wondered if it was the first microscopic seed of genuine remorse, or merely a final desperate attempt at the only skill he truly mastered, mimicry. Either way, the boy I raised was gone, replaced by a man who had to figure out his own soul. I thought back to the video testimonial Ilara and I had watched together after leaving the bank. The image of a vibrant, healthy Eleanor speaking from the screen was a gift I hadn't expected. She spoke to our granddaughter about the Garrison inheritance, explaining that it wasn't about the money Sterling had chased, but the courage to tell the truth when it costs everything. I finally understood why she had chosen me. By making me Sterling's father, she wasn't just hiding a secret. She was trying to give her son a soul he didn't naturally possess by surrounding him with the light of an honest man. I accept that I did my best with the years I was given, and that Alara is the true, untainted continuation of our story. Character isn't what we inherit, Ilara Eleanor had said on the tape. It's what we choose to keep when the world tries to take it away. I left the flowers. I kept the memories. I took the peace. As I turned to leave, the orange and gold Boston skyline began to glow at sunset, a city of millions that seemed a little safer now. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was Sarah Williams. The Garrison Initiative had just been officially adopted as a state-funded program, ensuring Eleanor's truth was now codified into permanent law. I walked toward the cemetery gates, the autumn sun warm on my back, And for the first time in my 70 years, I didn't feel like a teacher with a lesson. I felt like a man who had finally learned one. As you reach the end of this journey with me, there is one lesson I hope stays with you. This family story taught me that silence can be as dangerous as betrayal. For years, I believed protecting my son meant ignoring the cracks forming inside our home. That mistake nearly destroyed many lives. What some people call dad revenge was never about anger for me. This dad revenge was about responsibility, about standing up when the people you love begin to harm others. Looking back on this family story, I see my own failures more clearly than anyone else's. I spent 40 years teaching ethics, yet I still hesitated when it mattered most. If there is advice I can give you from this family story, it is simple. Never protect wrongdoing just because it shares your last name. Do not repeat my mistake. Ask hard questions. Watch actions more carefully than promises. And remember that even painful choices can lead to healing when guided by conscience and faith. In my darkest moment, I believed that God allowed me to see the damage not so I could punish my son, but so I could protect those he hurt. What many viewers call dad revenge was simply the moment a father chose integrity over fear. If this story made you think, share your perspective below. I would genuinely like to know, what would you have done in my place? If you feel this message could help someone else, consider sharing it and subscribing so we can continue reflecting on stories like this together. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. And please remember, parts of this narrative include dramatized elements created for reflection and education. If that style of storytelling isn't for you, feel free to choose other content that suits you better.